in the world is happening on Wall Street.
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is David. I am having a giggle here with John down the tube about mad things that happened or are still happening around the world. We'll talk about them. I hope you are well. I hope you're not going as kind of stir crazy and bonkers as the pair of us. But we are now going into week 10 of the lockdown. Apparently, we will be able to see a couple of people, I think it is, at a social distance. So be prepared for all those people that you couldn't stand. And thanks be to Jesus, you didn't see during the lockdown. They'll be the first people to call around. Isn't that going to happen? On that, there's a great, I was just thinking, Jinx Lennon.
Yes.
With Jinx Lennon. He's got a great song called Gobshite in the House, right? It's about what's going to happen next week, where you look out the window, there's a bing bong, you look out the window, and it's a gobshite.
And every gobshite in town is going to turn up.
Exactly. And Gobshite in the House is one of those great ones that nobody wants to answer the door to the gobshite. And it's an internal conversation that he's having with his missus or his mates of who's going to answer the door.
Right.
So Jinx, he's a brilliant, incredibly talented bloke. Jinx Lennon, the Dundalk troubadour.
Yeah.
Gobshite in the house, gobshite in the house, gobshite in the house, gobshite in the house. Who's that at the front door? Some old cousin, they're going to be here for the next half an hour, talking shit no one wants to hear about. The Santa's coming to the bedroom floor. I'm going to look for a long-wave radio station, see if they find some interference from a faraway galaxy, hopefully drive them out. The gobshite in the house, gobshite in the house, yeah. We're waiting for them to go, yeah. We're waiting for them to go, yeah. We're waiting for them to go, we're waiting for them to go, yeah. Gobshite in the house. There they go, out the front door. One arm, one leg, one shoe. They're gone. Thanks for the fuck.
It's great stuff. So that's Jinx Lennon, one of Ireland's finest troubadours. What's the crack, my friend?
The crack is good. And speaking of music, I was just kind of reflecting there last night about all the legends we've lost during COVID.
Your legends.
Well, you know,
I'm going for Jinx Lennon. Who are you going for?
Well, no, I'm talking about Little Richard.
Did he pass away?
Last week, yeah.
Didn't know that.
Or 2 weeks ago, was it, at this stage? Your man from Kraftwerk.
Yes.
And your man Dave Greenfield from Stranglers.
Yeah, I mean, the Stranglers, I would have, I got the Stranglers.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? I really
yeah.
got the Stranglers.
But he was the main sound. He was the keys.
It was the keys and the bass, I remember, being quite a very, very kind of really pumping bass, the Stranglers. And the keys, of course, are the Stranglers. Yeah. As for the Kraftwerk, kind of passed me by.
We were a bit young at that stage. They were kind of a few years ahead of us. But the influence they had on all the 80s music and all the
and the electronic music.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, it was very funny. I remember on the Kraftwerk issue, there was always in my head a unfortunate, not for Kraftwerk themselves, unfortunate correlation between pretentiousness and Kraftwerk in terms of fans.
Right.
And that came out most visibly at the Electric Picnic about 10 years ago when Kraftwerk played. And to be a real proper Kraftwerk aficionado, you had to wear a cycling top. Because they had this European tour idea in the 80s where they dressed up in cycling kit.
It's bad luck. That's a really
bad look.
Yeah.
So you have fellows of our ages with big Neds.
Yeah. That's a thing.
Looking like multicolored condoms going to Kraftwerk.
Mammals.
Yeah, exactly. So you've been lamenting the passing of
I
Grace.
have actually, yeah. I've been going through some music and stuff and just going, like, all of those guys were big influencers. But Little Richard, I mean, he was the king of rock and roll.
I don't know much about him.
Well, he was the very first guy who really was a showman. He had the whole makeup and all that kind of stuff and very effeminate. But he...
In the 1950s?
Yes.
As a black man?
Yes. And he broke so many barriers down. But Jesus, he could really rock it out.
Okay.
Dylan wrote a really lovely tribute
here he
to
goes. Somebody's Dylan. Here we go. Go on.
But Dylan talked about how he played on the same bill, and Dylan was just blown away by this guy. He was kind of...
Which is the experience nobody would have going to a Dylan concert.
That's kind of true, actually.
Do you remember we went to see Dylan in 1985?
Was it 5?
In Slane?
Yeah.
And he was brutal.
Well, if he
Come on,
came out,
objectively.
well, subjectively, first of all, if he came out and farted on stage, I would have just been
Well, maybe he did.
over the moon. But he was great. But I have to say, I've gone to see him a few times recently, and I walked out in one of them. That's how bad he is live.
Wow.
Now, but anyway,
Okay.
let's move on.
Well, it's been a very strange week, John. I think what's very important is something like what's going on. It's really crucial to actually develop language to explain what's going on. Because the interesting thing is economics is
What's wrong
not
with the language we have?
well, it's not very good with language. So basically, if you think about where language comes from, okay, language comes from a willingness, a demand that humans explain the world. So that's where it comes from. So, and the more complicated the language, the more sophisticated the language, the more things we're trying to express, the more things we're trying to figure out, the more things where language allows you visualize things. Okay, it allows you
Sure.
to describe things. So when you have something like what is happening now, which is a depression, a recession moving into a depression, but not like anything else, because it's so associated with a pandemic, you've got to change the language. So I've decided to come up with a new term.
Right,
Okay,
go on,
it's a
good.
pandession. What we're experiencing is a pandession, and that is an economic slump associated with the reaction to a global pandemic. And it's a totally unique thing. It demands completely different solutions because it's never seen before.
Right.
And it may well be the economic concern of the 21st century. Because if you talk to immunologists,
Yeah.
what they're all saying is this will come back. Maybe not COVID-19, but
Something. Well, yeah, there's a history of this. Yeah,
some form of COVID. So this is going to come back. And if we decide that the way we're going to react to it is locking down, flattening the curve, all that sort of stuff, at least the initial phases, we are going to be faced with economic catastrophe associated with pandemics. And this, in a globalized world, is going to become more likely to repeat itself than less likely. So rather than call it a recession, because it's not a recession, or a depression, because it's not a depression, we should call this a pandession, because it's a specific type of economic crisis. And it's a type of economic crisis that it seems to me will happen with some regularity in this century. And as a result of that, we need to figure out a 21st century way of dealing with it.
Do we have economic solutions to this yet? I mean, we're developing this all the time. This is brand new. We've been hit out of the blue. So we're kind of feeling our way. We are going in the right direction though, right?
We are going the right direction, but my point is that there's a huge amount of generals fighting the last war going on, right? So most of the economics profession is backward looking. It says this happened then, therefore we have the tools to deal with it. But nobody has figured out how to deal with this because it's never happened before. If you think, if we always in the past reacted to pandemics by more or less allowing the pandemic rip through the population, the curve was not only not flattened, it was actually accelerated, it peaked. And then what we know about contagious
There was
disease,
huge
huge death.
cost. Yeah.
So I contrast this, and I'm not talking about ancient times.
We're talking about the Kansas flu, aren't we?
We're talking, the Kansas flu is the 1918 flu, but there was another Asian flu that everyone's forgotten about in 1957, 58, when our parents were alive.
Yeah.
And, well, our mums are still alive, obviously. But I mean, when they were in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And it killed between 2 and 4 million people worldwide. In 1957, 58, it was an Asian flu, came from Hong Kong. And interestingly...
Geez, you don't hear much about that.
No, you don't. You don't. This is the interesting thing.
Yeah.
But they just allowed it was a flu. All Irish schools closed
Right.
in 1958. And in the summer of 1958, when it peaked, there were more people dying in Liverpool per week than were dying during the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. And nobody speaks about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why was there a hotspot in Liverpool?
There seemed to be a hotspot in the northwest of England. So Manchester, Liverpool, very badly affected by it. And of course, because we've so much contact with Liverpool, it came over on the mailboat.
So what's the story behind that then? Like where were the other hotspots?
All over. About 100,000 Americans died.
Right.
You know? But they basically, that generation's reaction to a pandemic was... it's an act of God because, and it's a health hazard, but we don't close down the economy. We, in contrast, have a totally different relationship with death than previous generations. And our view, and which I think is good, obviously, but it's a function of generational change. So you have a generation. Think about our parents' generations and the generations before that, right? Incredibly stoic people.
Yeah.
People who had lived through, who had maybe a collective memory of the famine going back to grandparents before that, right? And they lived with this idea that bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that the sanctity of life is there, but in actual fact, flus and pandemics and emigration and all these things just happen.
But they were also a lot more religious then. So they put a lot more of their faith in well, whatever
the big lad upstairs is doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking about up to the 1950s. So that's not that long ago.
But it's interesting, actually. When I was in India, I was quite taken aback by how cheap life was and how life was regarded, particularly the lower class and the very poor. Nobody gave a shit.
Yeah, people lived and they died.
Yeah.
I really noticed that in Varanasi when I was there.
Right, yeah.
This year, because Varanasi, of course, is the place where the Hindus, if you can end up getting buried in Varanasi, you go straight. You don't pass go.
Yeah.
You don't do any of the reincarnation stuff.
Yeah,
you go straight to the big man, to Nirvana. But again, death was part of the ceremony of death, and every day there'd be thousands of people buried, they'd be floating in the river. It's just part of the whole thing.
I was actually in a little village once, because remember I went over there when I was doing the environmental science degree, and I was in this little village, went to this huge walk through this beautiful sandalwood forest with these guys, and we came into this tiny little village, and there was just a dirt path for Main Street.
Yeah.
And in the middle, there was this pile of blankets that was kind of shaking and quivering. And I was going, what the hell is that? And I went over and I lifted up the blanket, and there was this old woman on her way out. And I went, Jesus Christ, would somebody do something? And they just looked at me and was, nah, she's doesn't have long to live. So they actually took her out of her house. And it was either, it might have been cholera, which I should have probably gone nearer then, but they left her in the middle of the street.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think of that sort of idea, and then we take the opposite view, right? Therefore, these pandessions are going to happen. And the interesting thing from economics is we know it's not like the Great Depression, because that was policy failure followed by the Roaring Twenties, okay?
Yeah.
It's not like the 1970s recession, the one that many people older than us will remember, where you have an oil shock, you have a massive recession.
Yeah.
It's not like the 2008 boom bust, where you have a banking, credit, housing boom that collapses and has to be paid for. And nor is it like the recession that you and I will remember as kids from the 80s, which was basically a homemade recession. That was Irish manufactured recession through two series of awful governments, one led by your man Gareth Fitzgerald and the other one by Haughey. And we made that recession at home. And it was an amazing thing. The whole world was booming in the 80s. Yeah. And Ireland managed, because of our own economic madness, to have a decade-long recession. Okay.
And obviously the big difference then was our release valve was London or the States.
Yeah.
But that's not there anymore.
So that's not there anymore.
Yeah.
So the pandession is something that we need to begin to think about as something that will recur again and again. And the reason it'll recur, John, is that in a way, the pandession is the biological cost of globalization. So what you look at, and I'm looking back at a lot of history these days.
What do you mean the biological cost?
So if you look at other pandemics, there was a great Justinian pandemic in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
There was the Black Death. There was the Kansas flu.
Yeah.
Right? Which I'm glad we continue to call the Kansas flu, Mr. Trump. But if you look at all these pandemics were preceded by extraordinary periods of openness, of people traveling, people meeting people they've never met before, people going to places they'd never met before. The economy had globalized dramatically. So if you look, even you go back to the Roman Empire and the Justinian pandemic, which killed about 20%, 30% of the population of the Roman Empire, okay? And particularly Rome. Extraordinary pandemic. What was happening at the time is the Romans had, under Caesar, and then a little bit later, they'd conquered everywhere from London, and they'd created cities from London all the way to Babylon, to Baghdad, south to Jerusalem, into Egypt, all of North Africa, out into Dacia, which was Romania.
Dacia, not Waterford, like.
No, the dish. I'll tell you a story about Waterford.
I'm sure you will.
But so they had created this empire. And what do empires do? Empires allow people to flow all over the place. So what you got was people were meeting people they'd never met before.
Yeah.
They were living in urban areas they'd never met before. They were trading with people they'd never met before. They were exchanging ideas, exchanging economics, exchanging money, and exchanging diseases.
Of course,
Right?
yes.
So that's the Roman side.
Yeah.
Then you look at the Black Death, 1347. What preceded that? You go 100 years before that. 100 years before 1347, Marco Polo is going to China.
Right, yeah.
The reason he's going to China is everybody's thinking at the time, go east. East is where all the goodies are.
Yeah.
So suddenly what you get is you get the opening up. What happens is,
This is the Silk Road.
this is the Silk Road. And what happens? So the Silk Road was always there.
Yeah.
But around 1100 AD, you get the Crusaders.
Yes.
The Crusaders are basically French, English, and German knights who go to a place they'd never gone before called Jerusalem to fight the Arabs. They go to Jerusalem, they set up huge communities all over there, and what they're doing is they're bringing home all sorts of ideas from the East,
Yeah.
and spices, and silk, and goodies that they never got.
Gunpowder.
And loads of gunpowder, because the Chinese figured
Yeah.
that out, right? So suddenly, a little bit like, remember when we were kids, everyone wanted to go to New York.
Yeah.
It's a cool place.
Yeah,
So you can imagine like Jerusalem was the New York of the time, or all these weird cities over there. Like, man, I want to go there. I want to hang out in the
Jerusalem, the city that never sleeps.
Exactly. But that must have been the way, right? So what happens again is after the Crusades, the Europeans start to move to the East. They start to discuss things with the East. They start to trade with the East. This is where the Genovese navy and the Genovese traders start to sail up through Constantinople, through the Bosphorus, into the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So again, a huge period of openness and invention and economic trade and people coming and going. Where does the bubonic plague come from? It comes from the far side of the Black Sea, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Genovese traders bring it back to Italy, and Italy is waylaid in the summer of 1347. And by the summer of 1349, half the population of Dublin is dead.
Wow.
That's amazing. But where does it? It's preceded by a great period of openness, globalization.
Yeah.
So we've got globalization a la Roman Empire. Then we've globalization a la Florentine, Genovese, Byzantine, post-Byzantine Crusader Empire. Look at the 1918 flu. 1918 flu comes after a period of amazing openness. From 1870 to 1918, including the First World War, John, this is a period of intense globalization. This is when South Africa becomes populated by non-Africans. This is when the colonies are populated by non-local people.
Right. Yeah.
This is when Latin America fills up with Italians, Spaniards, Irish, Brits, etc. This is when America fills up.
Yeah.
And what you have again, huge movements of people driven by commerce, trading with each other, exchanging ideas, exchanging money, and exchanging diseases. And obviously what brought the Wichita or Kansas flu was the direct transfer of American troops to Europe. They were actually the vectors. But the period prior to 1918 was a period of great openness. And what we think is that we are the only people innovating. We're the only organism that is innovating. But the disease is innovating too, and the virus is innovating. And they're trying to figure out, remember this,
evolution is a constant.
it's a constant character in all these stories.
Yeah.
It's there. It's like the sort of the shadow in the story.
Yeah.
And that's what, like, for example, Jared Diamond talks about. And he says the disease is clever. And what he's meaning is that the disease wants to live. It wants to reproduce.
Yeah.
It wants to evolve. And so you see...
It's like Richard Dawkins' principle of the selfish
the selfish
gene.
gene. So if you come back to this idea, John, exactly, Dawkins' notion, right?
Yeah.
So you come back to this idea that the biological cost of openness and globalization is a pandemic. And we see that in every single case. Because as we thought, these are crowd diseases. They love crowds, they love strangers. So we have to get our heads around that idea.
So just hold on there a second. Does this mean that there's an argument against globalization?
It's an observation against globalization. I don't know if it's an argument. I think, but one of the absolute obvious consequences of this
Yeah.
is deglobalization. That globalization, as we know it, as has been the dominant dogma since the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Yeah.
that is now going into reverse. Now, the question about diseases, John, or events, right, is that does the event change the world or does it simply accelerate trends we were already seeing?
Right.
And with respect to globalization, I think we were already seeing these trends. And it's clear to me now that America and China are on a Cold War II trajectory.
Would
Now-
that have been the case anyway?
I think it would have been.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think look, we went into 2020 with trade wars. Like, don't forget.
Yeah.
Trade wars, currency wars, etc. Right. So
Sorry.
it was in the ether anyway.
Yeah. You know, are you, in a roundabout way, are you saying that Trump is right again with his anti-globalization stance? You know, did he have an insight there, or
I think that.
is this conspiracy theory again?
No, I think that in the same way as Brexit taps into a feeling, Trump tapped into a feeling.
Oh yeah.
And the feeling is very much, and we spoke about it last week about the rise of the meritocracy.
Mm.
This idea that the elite are out there. So, for example, imagine you're an American now. You've lost your job, right? You want to get back to work. You don't have the disease. Okay, just go into the head of somebody. I mean, it's very, very easy to vilify these people, but you don't have the disease. Nobody you know has the disease. And if they have, they've got over it. Okay, just think that's right.
Yeah.
And you're a guy who left school at 16, 17, right? And you watch the telly, and on the telly are all these people, doctors and economists and fellas with master's degrees and PhDs, an alien subset to you, telling you, you cannot go back to work.
Yeah.
We know better than you, etc. That all feeds into this idea. But it's a much greater thing about the notion of emerging powers and eclipsed powers tend to go to war. This goes all the way back to the ancient Athenians and the Spartans.
Sure.
That there's an inevitability. That
And we spoke about this as well with the rise of Germany.
Germany against Britain in the First World
Yeah.
War. So basically, as one power begins to rise and another power begins to fall, so America's the falling power, the Chinese are the ascending power, there comes a moment where these powers tend to get into initially economic wars, propaganda wars, ideological wars, and then Cold Wars. And I think we're moving into that phase right now.
So is there going to be a huge difference between this particular Cold War and the previous Cold War insofar as that this Cold War we're going to be kind of living with COVID?
That's interesting. I mean, we're going to be living with disease. So the idea is that the China-America Cold War, and we'll come back to this in a second, is, like the last Cold War, going to force countries to take sides. It's going to split the world into spheres of influence in the way in which the period 1990 to 2020 did not.
Right.
So the period 1990 to 1920, communism disappears in the Soviet Union. You get this quasi-communist country called China, which turns deeply capitalist, and basically everyone's singing off the same hymn sheet, and we're all trading together, etc.
So where would this kind of divide, where's that line drawn?
Well, it's America versus China, and everybody else will make their choice as to where they jump. I think Europe would like to be kind of non-aligned, but won't be. I think the European disposition, despite our distaste of the American right and Trump and those guys, Europeans, basically Americans are Europeans stuck in a different continent.
Yeah.
That's what they are, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the best and the worst of Europeans. And I think the Europeans will side broadly with the Americans.
But in the period up until now, we've spent so much energy and time making these links.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the Russian gas and oil pipelines into Germany. So Germany are now pretty much dependent on Russia for their gas and oil, for their energy.
Germany is dependent on Russia.
So how does this line
It's very interesting.
divide?
The Russians have a massive interest in actually staying out of this, siding with the Chinese when it suits them.
Yeah.
In places like Venezuela, we've talked about that before.
Yeah.
Siding with the Western Europeans when it suits them, like in Germany. And playing what the Russians are really good at is chess. Figuring out, remember that the Russian told me, he said, the Americans are playing Monopoly and we keep playing chess.
Yeah.
With respect to geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
That was very, very good, right? So the Russians have an interest in staying out of this.
Yeah.
But my sense is that this is where we're going and that COVID crystallizes an already fractious world where we were going that way anyway.
Yeah.
And then the idea of living with COVID, I actually think that this idea of, the narrative is pre and post COVID.
Yeah.
People say, what's it going to be like post COVID? And what was it like pre COVID? I think we're going to have to figure out a new narrative. And again, this is what I come back to the idea of language is really important. So the Pandession explains what we're going through and people see it and say, okay, that's what we're going through. Living with COVID seems to be much more likely because what it is, it's going to be like living with AIDS.
Yeah.
It's not a pre and post. We will have to get used to this economy and take that as your framework and then see what do countries do. Now, I happen to think that this is an amazing opportunity for Ireland. I happen to think that the battle between China and America will be fought in supply chains, that the real change to the world as a result, the corporate world as a result of globalization, was supply chain management, that you could produce wherever the hell you liked. You could source whatever the hell you liked from whatever country. And what this made this made this crazy situation where multinational corporations had these incredibly long supply chains.
Right.
And incredibly fragile supply chains based on price.
Of course.
So you'd end up sourcing materials in the arse end of China, for example. You had no idea who you were doing business with. You put the price in, the supply chain algorithm did the rest for you. And he said, source from that person. When I saw about 4 weeks ago, Germany and America and Britain and France queuing up and trying to outbid each other for Chinese essential manufacturing goods like PPE, big alarm. I said, that ain't ever going to happen again. So what's going to happen is supply chains are going to truncate dramatically. They're going to become much, much less extensive.
Right. So much more manageable and
much closer to home.
And easier to protect.
And you will do business with people you trust.
Yeah.
And so there's another expression that I was thinking of, which was basically relationship capitalism.
Ooh.
That basically in the supply chain world of globalization, we allowed price beat security.
Yeah.
We allowed ideas of cheapness and remoteness beat trust. And we allowed an algorithm beat relationships. So basically, it didn't matter who you were doing business with. That's all going to change now after this, because you want to know who's on the other side of the line.
So what does this mean for Ireland then?
See, I think we have, if Irish people, not Irish people, the Irish state could just figure something out, which is the following, that our prosperity is based on, and as we've always said, small firms and multinationals.
Yeah.
Right? We've talked about the small firms and helicopter money and looking after them as much as we can, right? Let's think about multinationals. What has made Ireland a properly functioning economy has been the multinationals because the capital transfer has been amazing. So in the period of massive globalization from 1990 to now, the name of the game was you source labor-intensive parts of your production in cheap countries like China, and you source capital-intensive part of your production in expensive countries like Europe.
Yeah.
And of course, Ireland, because we gave a tax holiday to capital called the corporation tax rate, we made capital incredibly cheap to deploy here. So we got this investment bonanza. So what we were doing is we were playing this supply chain game and we were an incredibly successful cog in this machine. Now, there's many people argue that it gave too much money to the multinationals, et cetera, but this is what happened. And as a result, American corporations invested, think about this, more money in Ireland than they did in Brazil, China, India, Indonesia combined.
Wow, really?
Think about this, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, what happens when supply chains become truncated? The Americans will want to do business with people they really know, that they have a really strong cultural and maybe legal familiarity with. What is the country that is closest to America global supply chain, given that they have to supply Europe? It's us.
Yeah.
And we are still, unlike the Brits, members of the European community,
Yeah.
the European Union. So what we could do, remember we talked about this idea of the shares and the taxes and taking stock and all this.
Yeah.
We now to realize that it is an amazing opportunity for Ireland to reset the dial and present ourselves as the country that is on the supply chain, which has now been truncated from China, because Americans will not do business in the same way with China. Manufacturing and service industries could completely blossom here. But we've got to figure out our offer to the Americans.
But at the same time, I understand that, but at the same time, you know, Bleachman again has been going on about Ireland and it's getting a free ride.
Bleachman is gone. Donald Trump will not win the election.
Okay.
Do you know why? Because Joe Biden's going to do what Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan with poor old Jimmy Carter, who everyone liked.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's slogan
He
was, he said in his first election, right? The campaign was, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And everyone was worse off. And he destroyed Carter.
Yeah.
Sleepy Joe, all he has to do is say all the time, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago when Donald Trump came in? They've 38 million unemployed people.
I know, but that's
He
because of
cannot win.
COVID.
Doesn't matter. And then they're going to say, then he's going to point out that more Americans have died of COVID per head than anywhere else in the world. And he's going to say, we're the richest country in the world and we can't even protect ourselves. Trump is over.
On paper, I totally
He's
agree
over.
with you, but he's a dark horse.
But incumbent presidents only win when they have a record that they can stand over. His record is appalling. COVID has destroyed Trump, and he knows it. You can see it in his eyes. So I wouldn't worry about him. But it doesn't matter whether Trump's in power or not. The same dynamic's going to happen. Biden is going to be like, he's going to take the Obama team, I suspect, and bring it back in, more or less.
Yeah.
The most important decision he's going to make is who's his running mate, because Biden, if he gets in, he'll be far too old to run again next time out.
Yeah.
I would love to see him make Elizabeth Warren his running mate.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
And that makes sense for the Democrats. But to come back to Ireland, this is an amazing opportunity for us because we are the supply chain kings. And the supply chain is going to end in Europe, the American supply chain.
Yeah.
The west-looking one. East-looking one will probably end in Japan. But China will not be part of this game in the future. And ultimately, therefore, there is a massive prize for us to seize. But we've got to go and play the game.
Yeah.
And it's now time, as every week we promise you, for our Schumpeter slot. And this is about companies, mainly Irish companies, but we've got a good few international companies as well. Companies that are doing stuff, that are changing their product, that are, to use that awful word, pivoting in the virus to try and beat the downturn. So John's been putting the hex, as he usually does, on a new company. By the way, if you ever get a call from John Davis and you have a new idea, if I was you, I wouldn't answer the phone. But here he is.
So, Mark, I'm here with a husband and wife team, Joe Duffy and Mary-Therese Burke of Safety Pois, that's P-O-I-S, and they're introducing a new product to the Irish market that helps companies manage social distancing, whether it's an office or a supermarket or an airport or a museum or whatever. But before we get to that, tell us, what was life like before COVID?
Well, John, first of all, thank you very much for having us on the podcast. We appreciate it. It's great to get an opportunity to promote a new concept. We've set up our business 10 years ago.
From 2010, in the middle of the last recession. Outsourced media. We decided it was time to go out on our own. And we were both very passionate about sports and rugby.
So what was outsourced media?
We are advertising sales agency for the sports industry. So our partners that we work with, likes of Leinster Rugby, Munster Rugby, Aviva Stadium, Thomond Park, RDS.
So essentially you were doing the kind of advertising in the stadia.
The commercial advertising, yeah.
Right. So I'm sure sports has fallen off a cliff.
Well, since the announcement of the cancellation of the Ireland-Italy match, sport has pretty much ground to a halt in the country, across the board, across all sports.
Yeah.
And rather than sit in our hands and wait for something to happen, we decided to look around to see is there anything that we can be doing while we're waiting for the seasons to kick off again or to resume again.
And prior to pivoting, and
pivoting.
along with
that's
pivoting,
the word you like, John.
Yeah, that's the word I like. Yeah. Margaret doesn't, but that's okay.
coinciding with pivoting, we are obviously looking after our clients and liaising with all the stakeholders within sports.
Just on hold at the minute.
It's on hold, but there's a huge amount of work going on in the background, really positive, and just really looking forward to getting back into the stadiums as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But in the meantime...
Yeah, so tell us, what's the big idea?
The beauty of the system, John, is that every employer that's trying to reopen their workspace is faced with this challenge of how do they manage traffic flow within that workspace whilst maintaining social distancing. Our system takes the responsibility away from the employer and hands it back to his staff or the general public because it's intuitive. Everybody understands how a traffic light system works. And what we do is we map out that traffic light system on the floor of their premise or workspace. So when you walk in, you'll either be on a series of green dots, which means you keep moving, or you come to a red dot, which means you stop. If you're on amber, you have the right to pause for a few moments while you look in a window, while you speak to a colleague, and then you have to move on again. So it's intuitive. But as I say, the key to it is that it helps the employer manage those two key problems that they're facing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been hearing a lot of talk about the responsibility and the difficulty of getting people back to work. So this is an integral part of that.
Yeah, and it's a huge problem, not just for the next month or two, but this could go on into 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah.
And how do you manage this on an ongoing basis? And to be honest with you, putting manpower at the door of your building and saying, okay, no, we have too many people in there now, you're going to have to wait out here in a long queue in the rain. It's going to prove very, very difficult for people to manage this. So that's what our system Safety Paw, we hope, will bring to the marketplace is a mechanic to manage that for the employer.
Okay, and so tell us, how does it work?
Well, to give you a good example, currently when I'm going to supermarkets, it's great. I'm queuing outside the door. There's 2 meters distance, all feeling good. The minute I walk through the door, it's a free-for-all.
Right.
People are reaching over you at the shelves, and it's only until the point that you get back to the till, there's a dot to
That's
queue.
right, yeah.
Safety Paw resolves all those issues, but you're managed the whole way through. And it is intuitive.
So essentially you can guarantee social distancing, whether it's in a supermarket or in an office.
But unfortunately, John, when human beings are involved, it's very hard to guarantee
Well,
anything,
that's true.
but it's as near as you can get because, as I say, the system is based on human intuition and we all understand the traffic lights. But by and large, we believe people will and have been, it's been proved to be a huge success in Italy. And there's also now gone into the French, Spanish, German
It's
markets.
being rolled out in Australia.
Wow. So you guys here are looking after the Irish side of this.
And the partnership goes across the UK as well.
Right. This is going to solve a fairly immediate problem in the short term, but what's the future look like?
Well, I think in the long term, this will work across all sectors, whether it's airports, museums, shopping centres, corporate offices. Once it's in place, it will manage the traffic flow in these environments. For the consumer, it's making them feel comfortable in the environment. So visiting the supermarket on a more regular basis than they have been doing over the last 7 weeks.
Yeah.
And therefore, that turns into revenue for the supermarket.
Yeah, some of the best ideas are the simplest ideas.
Very simple, yeah.
And we as an Irish company are bringing it to the Irish market. We're bringing the concept from Italy, but we are producing it here in Ireland, supporting Irish companies and protecting the supply chain. God forbid there's a second or third or fourth wave across Europe. We'll still be able to get our product here in Ireland.
Well, listen, Joe, Mary-Therese, thanks a million. That's safetypaw.ie.
You can contact us on info@safetypaw.ie and we'll get straight back to you.
Brilliant.
That was a fascinating company. That's Joe and Mary-Therese. I'm wishing the best of luck. And again, keep your ideas and your company ideas and your nominees for these Schumpeter slots coming. You can probably tweet them to me at what is my Twitter handle again? At David MacW. So at David MCW.
Mark, remember we were talking before about the helicopter money and the ECB money. I was reading during the week about the goings-ons in the German Constitutional Court.
Very interesting.
Yeah, but how does that affect your thinking on funding and the bailout, as it were?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not really a bailout, but I'll come back to you, right? So the German Constitutional Court, the guys with the funny red hats, you might have seen them, right? They are, let's go back, right? When Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, was set up in 1947 by Konrad Adenauer, probably the most interesting German politician that nobody knows much about. But he was the post-war leader of Germany. They set up two institutions that really defined the Federal Republic. One was the Bundesbank, which looked after the money, and one was the Federal Court in Karlsruhe, which looked after the Constitution.
Right.
The reason these were so important for the Germans is, one, they believed that the hyperinflation of the 1920s set the scene for Hitler. So they said, we will never allow that happen again, and we're going to create this institution that's going to look after the money of the people, and the West German Deutschmark will never, ever, ever inflate again, because inflation threatens stability.
Right.
On the other hand, they set up the Constitutional Court, and they said this is the most important institution in the land because it guarantees that any German citizen, if a German government does something that they believe is anti-constitutional, they can go to the Constitutional Court and they can say, watch what these guys are doing. Anybody.
Right.
And the reason is, of course, that Adolf Hitler was a politician that destroyed the German constitution and then used the constitution against Jewish people and all sorts of things, right? So these are two incredibly important organizations, institutions for the Germans. They are the basis of the Federal Republic, and the Federal Republic is Germany, the old West Germany. Sure. Now, the Germans come into the European Monetary Union basically in this unbelievably ascendant position. And they said, and I know this because I worked in the Central Bank in Ireland doing the Maastricht Treaty and all this, they said, we will acquiesce to giving away the Deutschmark and replacing it with this European currency, the euro, if you undertake to make the European Central Bank basically the Bundesbank with different languages.
Right.
And in the European Central Bank's constitution are all these ideas that reflect basically Bundesbank thinking, an obsession with inflation.
Okay.
So now you fast forward 20 years. The obsession with inflation has disappeared because now the problem is deflation. But still the German thinking, they're called ordo economists, right? It's a German economic school called the ordo economists. They have become, interestingly, from having been the mainstream of German economic thinking, they have now become a kind of an eccentric bunch who believe that the Bundesbank can be rekindled. They believe the European Central Bank has deviated from its Germanic qualities. In effect, they believe the ECB has been taken over by Italians. There has been an Italian coup d'etat, and there has been. We can whisper it, but that's actually what's happened.
Right.
Is that
they've taken back the Bundesbank.
So what they don't understand is that, in a way, Germany has lost the battle, right? That by ceding sovereignty to the Europeans, they diluted their own mandate. And now what they're doing is they're fighting the last war. So they're going to their own constitutional court, even though that court has no competence over the ECB. And they're saying, please stop this. It's a bit like, you know, what happens in the truce in Ireland, right?
Yeah.
The IRA became, remember the real IRA?
Yeah.
And they were the holders of the flame and they were pure. But basically the world had moved on. And so what you have now is that the people who loved the Bundesbank, who are German academics, are taking these cases against the European Central Bank in the German Constitutional Court, but the German Constitutional Court has no mandate over the ECB. So it's like a court that has no mandate.
Right.
But it reflects a feeling in Germany.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, not only have they made this their crusade in the German Constitutional Court, but in actual fact, the Alternative for Deutschland, the Nazi party, came from an economic academic fighting for the purity of the Bundesbank. So they've weaponized the Bundesbank so much that they created a fascist party out of it.
Jesus Christ.
And the AfD is not really anti-immigrant, as everyone says, it's anti-Italian. Because the battle is actually in the Bundesbank and in who controls money. Back to what we talked about before. Who controls money? Who gets to print it? What the Constitutional Court have said is that the ECB will have to explain to the Germans what they're doing. But the interesting thing is, the ECB's answerable only to the European Court of Justice, not the German court.
Right.
So it's kind of They're playing to a German audience with no power. But the bigger question is, even if the court has no actual competence, right? And it's actually a bit like Sancho Panza, who was our friend Don Quixote's mate.
Oh, yes, yeah,
It's actually fighting windmills.
Yeah.
But does it reflect a deep chasm within Germany about the way in which the European project is going? Because they're saying, hold on a second, there has to be an end to all this money printing. Right now, you can print money because there's no inflation.
Yeah.
So the ECB's problem is not inflation, it's deflation.
Yeah.
But the straw in the wind is this the beginning of a German movement against the euro? And if it is, where does that end? That's the next big question. How you doing there? How's the lockdown going for you? Why don't you use it usefully to learn economics with me? Let's learn it together. What I have is the Trinity MBA course that I give. This course is largely based on that course. It's called Global Economics, getting your head around how the economy works. So have a listen. The intro is free on Patreon. If you like it, join up. There are thousands of us doing it now. Let's do it together. Cheers.